Thanks everyone for tuning in. My name is Eric Obenauf and I'm the editorial director at $2 Radio. And I'm going to be talking today with Melanie Finn, whose fourth novel, The Hare, and will be the third of hers that we'll publish at $2 Radio. And it comes out in January 2021, actually the Tuesday after the presidential inauguration. We also published a novel in 2016 by Melanie called Acclaimed, which was a finalist for the Vermont Book Award and the New York Times Notable Book of the Year. And excuse me, another novel of hers that we've published is The Underneath, which received a starred review from Kirkus in comparisons to Lauren Groff. I do also want to say that this conversation, if you ever want to revisit it or share it on social media or with a friend or something like that, we are recording this conversation and it will be archived at our website, which is $2radio.com, just all spelled out. And I think Melanie's internet may have just cut out, so hopefully she is able to get back on. So I'll just continue talking here for a second. She's in rural northern Vermont and she was just saying their bandwidth is kind of low. So the archive is up at our website, $2radio.com, and you'll just be able to click over to $2 Radio, and you can also listen, watch any of our previous conversations, which we have had them in the past with other authors like Dima Al-Zayat, whose Alligator and Other Stories we published this summer, and Tariq Shah, whose Whiteout Conditions came out in March. So that's where this conversation will be if you're interested in revisiting that. I did also just want to say briefly that Indie Bookstore Day is this Saturday, which for booksellers across the country is, you know, like Christmas, which and it's typically in the spring. Unfortunately, because of COVID, Indie Bookstore Day got bumped back till August this year, I guess in hopes that the pandemic would subside by then. Unfortunately, it's not, but you know, bookstores can always use the help and would appreciate, I'm sure, any kind of enthusiastic support you can throw their way. For anyone who is interested in pre-ordering a signed copy of The Hare, signed by Melanie, we have a link on our website to Norwich Bookstore in Norwich, Vermont, who is very generously handling those signed pre-orders for us. So now I'm going to have this conversation with Melanie about The Hare, which follows Rosie Monroe from a young art student in New York City to when she's later middle-aged and living in northern Vermont. And a whole lot transpires between those 2 points in time. And I remember the first time, Melanie, that your agent sent along the synopsis, and I read it, you know, and it was 2 paragraphs long. And I was like, there's no way that this can fit in like 300 pages. This book has to be 2,000 pages long. But it's not, and it never feels rushed or underwritten, but it's just immaculately paced. And I was wondering if you could just walk us through what happens with Rosie, between art school and later on. And I do think, Melanie, that you are on mute, which you might have to unmute yourself.
Right, there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. Really terrible internet here, so if I disappear, reappear. So Rosie is a young, unsophisticated woman in New York, and she meets at the Museum of Modern Art one day. She meets an older, 20 years her senior, very sophisticated East Coast money kind of guy called Bennett Kinney, and she immediately falls under his spell. And he seems like an exciting kind of guy who introduces her to this luxurious world on the East Gold Coast along Lake Southport and Long Island Sound. but that is sort of initial rosy bloom of things begins to take a darker turn when it becomes clear that Bennett is not all he appears to be, but because Rosie's so young, she's not able to see the red flags that maybe a wiser, more stable person would be. And they have to flee in the middle of the night to northern Vermont, to a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. And Bennett promptly leaves her there with their young child. And she's sort of forced to fend for herself in this remote place with winter coming in. So Bennett kind of comes back and forth in and out of their lives, and every time he comes in, he creates some new disaster. And about midway through the book, there's a real turning point for Rosie, where she has to make a decision about whether she can really move forward with Bennett continually disrupting their lives. And she takes some quite decisive action. The second part of the book takes place when she's in her mid-50s, and some of the actions of her youth kind of come back to haunt her. Her daughter is now in her 30s. Rosie is in her 50s. She's working at an egg farm for a really like a douchebag guy. And so a lot of the past unravels around her, and she is in a position of having to chart a course out of this. And that's what she does. And she does it obviously with a different perspective than the one she had when she was a younger woman. So the book hopefully reflects the way a young woman thinks and the way an older woman thinks. So that's the synopsis, Hare.
Yeah. Another writer that you've been compared to is Patricia Highsmith, and your novels have been referred to as literary thrillers and page turners. How do you go about structuring or pacing a story? And in the case of the Hare, where you're following Rosie, from when she's 20 till 50, was that always the approach that you wanted to take, or was it? Or were you thinking originally that you might just hone in on one aspect of your life, and then the thread just led you to this larger story?
I always wanted to tell the story of an older woman looking back on a number of traumatic events in childhood and youth, partly because I went through menopause this year, not this year, but the last few years, and there's a fundamental shift that happens. You really look back on your life. There's a new part that starts after that, and then there's the part before. And so as a writer, I wanted to explore that younger self from an older perspective. So that was always inbuilt. The comparison to Patricia Highsmith always thrills me more than anybody else, because I love detective thrillers, and I love stories that deal with essentially good people who just get muddled up in bad things, and they do bad things, and sometimes they do really bad things. And understanding that all of us have that ability to really fall off the rails just fascinates me as a writer. So with the structure of this, I started with Rosie in middle age, and then I kind of deconstructed her to go back. I knew what had happened to her as a child. So I wanted to figure out what that trajectory would be, having had that abuse as a child, some of the things that she might do or situations she might find herself in as a damaged person. So really clinging very closely to that. And then the character of Bennett, to be honest, sort of after Trump was elected. That's another question, right?
Yeah. So at one point, before I had even started reading The Hare, you had expressed to me that you thought this book was the best piece of writing that you had done, which I thought was bold, and is to be honest, is something that I've heard from other writers before. But after finishing, I did agree with you, and I just feel so fortunate to be working with you again and on The Hare. So thank you for the opportunity. But early readers too, that we've had take a look at it, like our staff here who are familiar with your work, and also the writer Claire Fuller, who gave us a blurb for the Hare, told me it was the best book that she'd read in recent memory. And I think that, well, I'm curious to hear what led you. Is this sort of like the rush or high that you get from finishing any project? You're like, this is the best piece of thing I've ever done.
No. So
or
again, I think this is something new to be able to say, I really like this and I'm really proud of this. I think that writers, maybe it's a woman thing, I don't know, but we're constantly self-effacing, like it's not really very good, or I'm really worried about this. But I finished this and I felt happy with it. Like, yes, this is right and it's true and it says what I think I've waited all my adult writing life to write. So, obviously every book is somewhat personal. And I think of all my books, this is the most personal. So I had to get it right because it's the most about my own experience in life. So to come to the end of it and say, yes, I said what I wanted to say, felt great, right? So, and then to have people like Claire say that, yes, you did get it right, is just tremendously, it feels good. And we don't ever get to say that very much. We actually say, yeah, I feel really good about this. We're supposed to say, well, I'm not sure. What do you think? Right? I feel good about this book. And I love that people are connecting to it.
Yeah, that's great. Me too. An element of the book that so when we were writing the synopsis, there were some of these terms that we were throwing around and we weren't sure like what necessarily to bring up in terms of Me Too and the Brett Kavanaugh Supreme Court confirmation hearing. But it reads to me like a very feminist book, and a lot of the issues that it tackles, are pretty topical now. In the wake of Me Too and the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. And also, like you mentioned just a few minutes ago with the election of Donald Trump, can you talk about how these issues inspired Rosie's story in The Hare?
So I think that, again, going back to this age thing, and one of the things that the Trump presidency and the Brett Kavanaugh hearing was sort of realizing how casually insidious this misogyny is. And growing up with that, and I'm older than you, Eric, I'm 55, right? So that was just normal. That was how women were treated, and nobody thought about it. Like with Jeffrey Epstein, like it was just what happened, right? What happened when you were a girl and you just got over it. These things were just casually thrown out. So, and then when you get to this age and you suddenly see something like the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, and people are kicking up a fuss and saying, this was wrong, it shouldn't have happened, you suddenly sort of think, well, gee, maybe it shouldn't have happened. And maybe the people who should have helped it not happen should have been more assertive. But then you see they were this sort of stuck within their own prisons of social behavior. So I was reading something today about this idea of calling people who've survived sexual abuse survivors or victims. And the problem with that terminology is that it sort of pins you as someone who managed against all odds to get over something terrible. And that if you don't do that, you're not a survivor. There's a terminology there that I've also begun to really explore. And what I loved about Rosie is she's not a survivor. She just kicks ass, right? Like, yeah. But she's damaged. She's damaged by what's happened, but it doesn't, in the end, define her. And so I think so many women and men have suffered sexual abuse or abuse of some kind that you can feel like this defines your entire life and you're swimming upstream against it forever and ever and ever. And the message that I really wanted in this book is, not only is there another side, there's another side to that. You do get out of it, but you actually look back and you're almost grateful that it happened, because it gave you a resilience and a strength and a perspective that you would never have had if you just had a beautiful, happy, wonderful childhood. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I hope that through the book it does.
Yeah. And something else we spoke about too is just like how trauma is passed down from one generation to the next, or this cycle of abuse, or how it can be perpetuated just because, you know, with in the case of Rosie, how she goes to such how she makes such a point of sticking up for Miranda and her daughter Miranda, you know, and not permitting her to be put into a similar situation that she was put in as a child too. And I think that there was a news story or something that you were telling me about, an interview with a mother who was standing beside her daughter.
Sorry, there's like horses neighing outside. Like the horses have chosen this moment to get out of their corral that I've spent 2 weeks fencing.
That's great. That would make it for a neat band backdrop too.
Yeah, I think there's sort of two answers to that question. So the first is having daughters myself, and realizing how fiercely protective I was, and trying to understand my own mother, her inability to protect me. Like that's a very complicated thing to come to terms with. Just the fierceness that I feel in protecting my children, and the extent to which I would go to protect them. But this whole Brett Kavanaugh thing, there was a story. There's this woman in Montana, and in the background is her daughter, like, I don't know, feeding a horse or something. And this mother is saying, well, you know, this sort of thing just happens to teenage girls. You know, it's just something that happens. It happens to everybody. You know, you just get over it. And I'm like, your 14-year-old daughter's in the background, and you think that her being groped and possibly raped is something that just happens and you just have to get over it. Like, I'm going, well, what is this context? Like, this is socially acceptable for someone to say on television. Well, what does it mean by what we're saying when we're not in public? So I think that there's a tremendous amount of societal consent that goes very, very deep in our culture about seeing young girls as currency. I mean, this whole Jeffrey Epstein thing is part of that. It's like these girls were just currency. They were just something that got handed around like a cocktail, or, you know, a joint or something. And we live in a society still that somehow condones that because of the power structure. I mean, there's books written about this, but that's why I wrote this book, because it's a way to put it in a narrative form that people can maybe connect to, I hope.
Well, another issue
the horse is out there now on the lawn, just eating, and the other horse is whinnying from the pasture. Sorry.
That's great. I honestly can't hear the horses, but I do think it would provide for a nice soundtrack too, little ambiance. But another issue that you do that comes up in the book too is that of class. And Rosie comes from a very humble upbringing, living with her grandmother, being raised by her grandmother after the death of both her parents in a blue-collar town. And then she's swept away by Bennett, you know, who's much older, with access to the upper class. And she spends the next couple of years with Bennett, living with him in a boathouse on this estate on Connecticut's Gold Coast. And then, you know, the majority of the book actually takes place with Rosie being incredibly poor, raising a daughter as a single mother, living in rural northern Vermont, in a cabin without insulation. When she first arrives, she's learning how to keep a fire in a stove and snowshoe into town with her daughter strapped to her back, to pinch pennies at the bargain grocery, to forage and hunt for game in the forest. And so I'm just curious how you went about inhabiting these absolutely polar mindsets and just capturing them with what feels like such authenticity.
Well, I mean, part of it was I lived in that part of Connecticut for a while and had access to those unbelievably rich people. And through my life, I've also encountered these just bonkers rich people, I mean, billionaires. But I live in a very rural community here that is the poorest part of Vermont. And having worked in schools here and worked in an elder care facility, you see this other side. I'm also a writer, so I've been like broke for most of my life. So the idea of worrying about money is something that's really immediate. But that real grinding poverty and that perspective that poverty gives you, I certainly have encountered here. And there's a scene in the book where Rose is talking about Brett Kavanaugh. Rose is middle-aged Rose. And she's talking about Brett Kavanaugh, and the women in her book group don't see Christine Blasey Ford as a victim at all. They're like, she's got nice hair, she's professional, she lives in a nice house. Like, how can she be a victim? And I think that's a perspective that was maybe lost in that whole conversation. Was Christine Blasey Ford has done okay. We have, millions of poor women who are stuck with these experiences, and they have no way of dealing with them. And their poverty simply reinforces their helplessness. And I also think that the whole money thing, the rich gaslight the poor a lot. So you hear all this stuff about people on welfare and poor people who don't do anything. And the truth of it is, in this country, the vast majority of very wealthy people have inherited their wealth. So it's not like they went out and earned it. Someone gave it to them, the way poverty was given to people who are poor. So because I'm dealing with this inequality, this young woman who is disempowered in so many ways, I felt like the money part of it was so important too. And the way that rich people blame poor people for being poor, and poor people just kind of accept that as, yeah, well, I guess it's my fault I'm poor, and don't see the systemic reasons for poverty any more than they see the systemic reasons for misogyny and sexism. So it all sounds very academic, putting it this way.
There's so I just have a couple more questions for you, and then if anyone has any questions for Melanie, there's a feature at the bottom of the screen, the Q&A feature, and you can just type in a question, and then I can sift through there and ask that to Melanie. So if anyone does have a question, feel free to ask it. And the next question I have is it might be related to your response that you just gave in terms of like having lived and been exposed to these different classes. Is one of the things that I love about your book is that they take place in such distinctive locations. The gloaming was set in a small rural Swiss town in Tanzania, and the underneath was in remote Vermont in Africa. And the Hare takes place for the first 75-ish pages between Connecticut's Gold Coast and then northern Vermont. And I know that you worked for a number of years as a journalist as well. And I just feel like you bring such like a journalist's eye to your descriptions and places and locations. And but how do you go about crafting such distinctive locations for your stories, or settling upon them?
Well, I make stuff up. Yeah. I think it's a combination of I don't know. I think that's just something I'm good at. I'm good at looking at a place and describing it and making it feel real. I think that's something that comes relatively easy to me as a writer. And I feel like if you are going to convince your readers that this is a real story, it has to feel like such a real place. And so, details have to be really important in that writing. And here, as in fact happens with the section in the Gold Coast, Rosie really begins to notice the natural world. That really filters through. And I think that's what really places her here in the Northeast Kingdom, is when she starts to, notice the seasons and notice the smells. Has a tremendous olfactory sense. Just as when she's in the Gold Coast, she's thinking about the sea, the light of the sea, and the small shorebirds that come there. So I think it's that sense of noticing the natural world in this book, certainly, that really gives that sense of place. And if I could turn the screen and show you outside, you would see what there is to write about here. I mean, just stunning mountains and green forest and a horse eating on the lawn. But so yeah, and I think that's important to create that complete. And people say, "Oh, I know exactly where you're writing about." And I'm like, "No, I made that up." But the fact that people think they know the house, the road that I've written about, tells me that I've actually done the work. So,
and
yeah.
one of the other things that we haven't mentioned yet in terms of like the description is in the last maybe third of the book, there's this sort of like mysterious ghost-like presence stalking the highways and the young women on the highways. That which kind of felt almost like torn from headlines. How do you see that fitting in with the broader story arc of Rosie and her character and her relationship with Bennett and her daughter?
So it's a really interesting question, Eric, because I think I did struggle with that as well. And at a certain point I took it out of the book, and at a certain point it was actually part of the plot of the book. And I still have questions, and I welcome people to read it and comment on whether they think that element, that strand has worked and what it actually does. But for me, it was this sense that women are constantly walking in a world of very real danger. And hold on. It's like being in Uganda in 1998 or something with the internet here. But this is a real fact. Like, there are people out there killing women, and I know that there are people out there killing all sorts of other people, but this is a book about women and what happens to women, and specifically what men do to women. So the fact that there were a few years ago a series of murders that took place here. There was a highway killer, and then there was another terrible murders of women that took place here. Like, how do you tell your children about that? This is a reality, that it's not just, oh, you know, I was abused and I got over it. There's a real threat in the world as a woman that you walk into and you have to calibrate all the time. So I wanted that threat to be more than existential. It's absolutely real. And in rural communities, it's often doubly real because, you know, there's not the police force to I actually read 2% of crimes are solved in this country, right? 2%. So yeah. 2% of murders are solved, 2% of rapes, whatever. That's pretty poor.
Yeah, it is pretty poor. I was thinking too, I mean, of course, I'm on your team here and your editor and whatnot, but I just thought you handled that so well without it being this existential threat, where it is this very real haunting figure that, well, I don't know. It's difficult in terms of not wanting to give too much away, but it did remind me in certain regards of one of the sections of Roberto Boiano's 2666 with the women in Juarez who are disappearing. And there's, have you read that book?
I haven't. So I'm going to have to write it down and read it.
It's pretty cool. It's long if you have a lot of time to do that.
I'm reading the Brothers Karamazov now. I have been for 3 years. So.
Oh, yeah. So the last question I have, which again, if anyone does have any questions for Melanie about this book or previous books, you can just type into that Q&A feature. But the way that the Hare ends, it's with such a striking scene, and I love it so much, and it feels so natural and perfect. And obviously I don't want you to say what happens or anything like that, but how did you always know that that was where the book would end?
I did always know. I think that the ending is a funny thing. I think a lot of writers actually start with the ending. They know where they want to go. And I know that my endings have been problematic for readers before. They don't quite get it, or some people get it and other people don't. It's something I've been criticized for. So I knew that I wanted to have an ending that was both mysterious and yet clear. Like, I wanted to hit both of those things. It wasn't like, and then happily ever after, or and then, everybody dies. I want that carry on so that you feel there's a whole other story that's going to happen after this. But I knew exactly the feeling of liberation that I felt personally, having turned some corners in my life. So I won't, there's no point in giving away, but as I wrote that scene, that whole last scene, I couldn't stop writing. It was one of those, writers, it's a horrible profession. You sit there for hours and hours and hours at your desk, cramped over, your butt goes to sleep, nothing's working, you delete what you wrote yesterday. It's a horrible profession. But every once in a while, you have this where you just sit down and you're on fire. And that whole last scene, it just took me. It had wings. But I have a question for you, Eric. So, as a man reading this book, one of the things that I've struggled with in rereading it is that I don't want it to come across as like male bashing. And I wondered, like, as a man, did you feel that I was like trying to make you feel guilty or not very good about yourself, or like?
No, I
what was
didn't.
your
I didn't
reaction?
feel that way. I don't know. I mean, I'm a straight white man, so it's like I'm tired of hearing what straight white men have to say. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about what I thought about that. Obviously, I love the book tremendously, and Rosie is such like a strong, engaging character. I just wanted to stay with her, even after this book ended. And yeah, so, and also Bennett's such an asshole. I mean, like, I don't know. I never felt like, yeah.
I kind of like, I think Bennett, one of the things I've been accused of is, am I writing about my husband? So if you remember in the underneath, like what Kay does to her husband, she thinks about smashing his head in.
Yeah.
And so in this book, Rosie Rosie is again up against, so I'm like having to reassure my relatives, it's really not based on my husband. I did date, and I think most of us have dated somebody at some point who just said a bunch of bullshit, and we didn't think that it was until later. I mean, when people tell you things, you generally seem to think they're saying the truth, and it's really a shock when you start to unravel it. And even more, like with our president, when you realize it's like pathological to just tell lies, and to not even know anymore the line between truth and lying. There's not a line, it's the same thing. It's just words that come out of your mouth, whatever you think. So yeah. Anyway, but just one more thing about the man thing. I did want to have one character in the book because I do think it's important how women raise their sons,
Right.
and how we encourage young men to be better. And as my girls approach teenhood, I'm especially aware of the kind of boys I want them to hang around. So
yeah.
Anyway, okay.
Well,
sorry, go ahead.
The male teenager that Rosie kind of befriends at the end of the book, which I can't think of his name.
Nick.
Nick. Yeah. But he seems like a really endearing character too. And while he might make mistakes, and he clearly doesn't condone his father's behavior or anything like that. So, yeah, that's a positive male figure there. And what you touched on about your husband Matt being the inspiration for you, the characters, or actually a conversation that Eliza and I had previously was about, in particular with the underneath, with the children and with Kay's, like, one interaction where she calls her daughter a name, and then, it becomes this very large situation. So Eliza and I have had that conversation before, trying to call whether some of those incidents from the novel were pulled from real life, but you don't have to answer that.
No, but clearly when I do the school run, there are other mothers looking at me like, did she really call her? Or did she really think about smashing Matt's head in with a hammer? I mean, like you live in a community. There are people who, like, your characters are an avatar, obviously, but they really are rolling stones that gather their own moss. And I think Nadine Gordimer speaks beautifully about that. It's like you're exploring another avenue of life that you might have lived, but as you proceed down that avenue, everything changes. It's not like, I wonder what would happen if I smashed Matt's head in with a hammer, right? I wonder what would happen if I was at that place in time, and then it goes on from there. So yeah, it's kind of like you get to just live all these other lives as a writer that are nothing to do with your own.
So a couple questions that we've gotten. One person was asking about getting a copy of the book, which you can pre-order signed copies, when pre-order for when the book is actually released in January. But you can get signed copies from Norwich Bookstore in Norwich, Vermont, which there's a link to their page for the book on our website, which our website is $2radio.com. And then you can search for the Hare, and then there'll be a link to that. And then you're also welcome to and encouraged to pre-order from your local favorite independent bookstore. And again, with this Saturday being Indie Bookstore Day, it's a great time to do that. And also you could ask them if they don't have a copy of Melanie's previous books in stock to order them for you. Another question we got, which we actually got the same question twice. A couple of people were curious about how our partnership developed between Melanie and $2 Radio.
You want me to answer that?
Yes. Your agent submitted it to us.
Well,
actually, it might have been Sophie, right? Who did?
Yeah,
she
it was Sophie. So I got. She did. So my book, The Gloaming, which you published as The Gloaming, was published as Shame by Weidenfeld and Nicholson in the UK. And we tried to find an American publisher, couldn't find an American publisher. Everybody said no. And then Sophie, who had been my editor, said, I just know this amazing, small publishing house, and wrote you this passionate letter about shame. And you took it on. And I love that you renamed it, because I actually had always hated the title Shame. I love The Gloaming. And, you did this great job with it. And I was so happy to work with a small publishing house for many reasons. Not only do I love you and Eliza, your ethos and everything that you do as people, but with a small publishing house, you guys don't take that many books on, and you're completely committed to them when you do. With a big publishing house, you have like a 1 or 2 week window, and if your book doesn't hit a sweet spot, they've moved on, and you're suddenly like, nobody will be responding to your emails. So, that's very frustrating as a writer. And that was also why with this book, you were super busy at the beginning of the year, and you're like, well, feel free to take it to other publishers. Like, I don't want to work with anybody else. I really don't. Not only because you guys are you have this wonderful morality and ethos about everything you do. I love all the other writers you represent. It's just a privilege to be on such a great stable. So that's my relationship with Eric and Eliza.
And we feel,
as I spoke with Eric today, they do their own, like, this is the most beautiful cover. And it's like they're so talented. They come up with these amazing covers as well as everything else, and have 2 kids. And I don't know.
Well, thank you. Obviously we feel very fortunate to be working with you, and I love the fact that this is our third book and whatnot. But that was an interesting process in terms of Sophie, I guess, encouraging your agent, to send Shame the Gloaming to us. And that book had been out in the UK, I think, for almost a year before, right? Before we published our paperback version in the US. But that also leads to maybe an interesting question too about the titles, because The Gloaming was originally titled Shame. I can't remember exactly what the underneath had a different title as well, and the Hare had a different title too. Do you want to share what any of those alternative titles were before we?
I can't quite remember the underneath, but I remember the Hare. So it was initially titled the Giggle Man, which is the name that Rosie gives to her abuser. And I quite liked the Giggle Man because I thought, oh, it sounds very sinister. But Eric came back, I think it was both of you, Eric and Eliza came back and said, well, we both feel really strongly that it shouldn't be named after her abuser. It should be named after her. And I felt that was so profoundly insightful. There was no argument after this. Okay, we call it the Hare. And I'm really grateful for that, because you're right, the Giggle Man. Why name a book after her abuser and give him more air, as it were? Sorry, I keep getting up to check the internet.
So if anyone has any additional, what's that?
One bar.
Hey, we're making it work. It's great. If anyone has any additional questions for Melanie, I would say send those in right now. But with the Hare, the title, you did have a section that was titled the Hare, and then we just.
There is a section titled the Hare.
But also, and I think Rosie too.
I think I sent you a picture. I had, when I was snowshoeing with the girls, we found this mummified dead hare under our neighbor's porch. And it's just this beautifully preserved hare. So it had little bullet holes in it. You could see what had happened to it. So somehow that inspired me to write about that within the book too. That we all carry the scars.
And Rosie too does seem to be very attuned to the plight of animals. And also, I think your very first book, which came out in 2006, doesn't it start? Doesn't it?
2004.
2004. Doesn't that open with a scene of like an animal that's been struck on the road or something? Am I making this up?
Yeah.
I'm making this up. I'm sorry.
No, you're not making it up. I think it's very perceptive. Animal abuse is an ongoing theme.
Yeah.
In my books. I mean, I'm not like a vegan or anything, but I think there are real questions about how we view animals, and certainly Rosie has a sympathy for both wild and domestic. And yeah, I mean, I think that they're also symbolic of how we treat each other. So yeah, animals appear a lot in my books, that is true. And they have different meanings.
And I was just trying to type up a link while I was asking you that question, so I apologize. But if no one has any additional questions for Melanie, I would just say thanks again so much for tuning in. Melanie, thanks so much for sitting down and having this conversation with me today. Like you said at the beginning when we were in the little waiting room, this is the first time that we've spoken like face to face over the course of having worked on 3 books together. So I do hope that one day we are able to hang out in real life.
I hope so too. And thanks, Eric. Again, I'm really happy, so proud to be published by you guys, by $2 Radio. So, yeah, and any other questions from readers, just send them through to me. I'm always happy to answer and ask questions.
And again, if anyone wants to revisit this conversation, you can visit our website, which is $2radio.com, all spelled out. It'd be under the $2 radio link, and there'll just be an icon for it. And you can watch the video or just listen to the audio. And then Norwich Bookstore is running a pre-order campaign for signed copies of the Hare. So you're welcome and encouraged to pre-order through them for that. So thanks again, everyone. Melanie, take care. I will talk to you soon.
I will. Thanks, and thanks to everybody for tuning in or zooming in or whatever the terminology these days is. So
yes.
Okay.
Be safe. Right. Be safe. Talk to you soon.
Yeah. All right. Bye.